calling to order this hearing. It's technically a round table. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chair of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole, and this hearing is being conducted by the Committee of the Whole. Today is Friday, April 7th, 2017. The time is 1:36 in the afternoon. We are in room 412 of the John A. Wilson building. And the subject of this hearing, and this actually is the first of two hearings that the committee is having this afternoon, the second hearing to follow immediately at the conclusion of this hearing. The subject of this hearing is consideration of PR Proposed Resolution 22-190, which is entitled The Sense of the Council Supporting the National Mall Underground Parking Feasibility Study Resolution of 2017. This legislation was introduced by myself and Council members Jack Evans and Charles Allen on March 21st of this year. And the stated purpose of PR 22-190 is to declare the sense of the council, to declare that it is the sense of the council, to support a national mall underground parking feasibility study, to evaluate the concept of a parking structure to be built under the national mall that would also serve as a retention structure to reduce or prevent flooding in the district's Federal Triangle area. The feasibility study would be undertaken by the Planning Division of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, Baltimore District, and would involve an economic analysis of the feasibility of constructing an underground structure. The total cost for the 12-month feasibility study is estimated to be $100,000. The cost to the district would be zero, as the National Mall Coalition is committed to covering the entire cost of the study, or at least that's my understanding. So that's what we're going to explore this afternoon in this hearing. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, the record will close on Monday, April 21st, 2017. We have a number of witnesses. I see three people at the table: Arthur Cotton Moore, Judy Feldman, both with the National Mall Coalition. David Marlin, are you testifying?
Well, I'm really here just in support. I'm a member of the board of
Okay.
the National Mall Coalition.
Okay.
And
then,
my testimony will be to thank you for holding this roundtable so that we can express our the plans for this underground garage.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
So you're not on the witness list, and you just slipped in your testimony before the two people who are testifying. Good job. And Richard Lehman wanted to also testify. Why don't you come forward, because there are 4 seats. We'll begin with either Arthur Cotton Moore or Judy Feldman, however you want to do this.
I am Arthur Cotton Moore, and again, Mr. Chairman and council members, I thank you for holding this hearing. I am a native Washingtonian and an architect of many projects in the city, including Washington Harbor, the restoration and modernization of the Library of Congress, the saving and renovation of the old post office, addition and modernization of the Phillips Collection, the renovation of the Cairo Hotel, the Portals Complex, and many more. I am about to publish a book on my many pro bono publico projects in our nation's capital, of which the National Mall Underground is one. The study of the underground, which the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sees as a potential model for flood control projects across the country, will be completely funded by the National Mall Coalition. The work will be done by the Corps, and this requires no funding or work by the D.C. government. As the design architect of record of the underground, I have been working on it for 4 years and have received assistance from these companies: Clark Construction, Colonial Parking, Partners for Economic Solutions on a cost-benefit analysis and studies, Garove Slade on traffic, Wiley Engineering on geothermal. We have met with many federal agencies, including GSA, the National Park Service, the Smithsonian Institution, U.S. Park Police, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Secret Service, and the architect of the Capitol. We have made very many trips to Capitol Hill, meeting with Representative Norton, Senator Ben Cardin, and the staffs of a long list of key committees. We've also met with D.C. agencies, including the Office of Planning, the Department of Energy and Environment, and DDOT. And we have reached out to the Federal City Council, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, groups promoting tourism, the Downtown and Southwest Bids, and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which stated in its 2015 study on tour bus parking that the proposed National Mall Underground would be the most dramatic improvement in bus parking capacity. We all are familiar with the present situation of disorganized, above-ground tour bus parking and the practice of idling engines, which contributes to our city having one of the highest rates of pediatric asthma in the country. The car parking part of the underground is designed solely to serve visitors to the museums and memorials. It would open late in the morning and would be controlled by price, making it not practical for commuters. This project is designed to be largely self-funding with revenue from water credits, irrigation payments, bus and car parking fees, geothermal charges, concessionary rents, and other sources. We have had preliminary discussions about financing with people on Wall Street who were enthusiastic about its financeability. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Judy Scott Feldman, the founder and chair of the National Mall Coalition, who will give our slide presentation, after which we would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Feldman?
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, and thank you for holding this roundtable. I'm Judy Scott Feldman, a native Washingtonian and founder and chair of the DC-based nonprofit National Mall Coalition. The Coalition is an all-volunteer organization of architects, preservationists, and concerned citizens advocating comprehensive long-term planning for the National Mall in its third century. Our board members include philanthropist and businessman Albert Small, who first proposed the underground concept, and architect Arthur Cotton Moore, who's the design architect. Today, one of the key planning challenges for the mall is that a host of agencies shown in this diagram each plan for their parts of the mall, but no one plans for the larger needs of the district and the American public. One of our goals in developing the National Mall Underground project was to demonstrate that one multi-purpose facility could address the needs of all constituencies, thus benefiting everyone while also reducing cost and construction disruptions. The underground would be located under the central grassy panels of the mall between the 9th and 12th Street tunnels, with entrances and exits off Independence Avenue. It could have 2 or 3 stories with room for about 1,000 cars and over 100 buses, plus a welcome center with restrooms, first aid, and food vending. Irrigation cisterns at each end would collect rainwater and groundwater flow from nearby buildings to be used for mall irrigation. During heavy rain events, vehicles would be removed from the lower levels and up to 24 million gallons of stormwater runoff could be collected here. A geothermal field, included at the request of Dan Tangerlini, former DC City Administrator, Transportation Director, and head of GSA, would provide new sources of clean energy for nearby buildings. Consultation has been important to this project, as Mr. Moore stated in his testimony. We first briefed district and federal officials at a meeting of the National Capital Planning Commission in 2013. Since then, we've consulted with numerous district and federal agencies and civic groups. There has been much enthusiasm for the project, but also some questions I will now address. Before 2006, few people knew that the mall had any risk of flooding besides Potomac River overflow. But the June 2006 Federal Triangle flood changed that. It was stormwater, interior flooding from 2 days of heavy rains, not river flooding, that devastated mall area buildings. The extent of the flooding is visualized here. DC Water and NCPC put together a working group that evaluated the problem and proposed in a 2011 report a number of possible solutions. One was to construct a stormwater reservoir under the mall, but cost estimates of $400 million seemed prohibitive, and government agencies took no action. Our idea since 2013 has to make that reservoir concept both feasible and fundable by making it useful and beneficial all the time with parking, public services, and so on. And in fact, Cost-benefit analysis shows that parking fees, water credits, and so on help make the facility substantially self-funding. Won't the facility attract more cars to city streets? In fact, congestion in D.C. is primarily a rush hour commuter phenomenon. The facility would open only after 10 a.m. In addition, the coalition has pledged to fund a separate traffic study once the Army Corps feasibility review is underway. One topic there is no controversy about is the need for tour bus parking. Tourism is an economic engine for the district. Recent studies by DDOT, the Park Service, and the Council of Governments offer no easy solutions, but COG finds that, quote, the proposed underground National Mall parking garage concept is currently the most ideal site and, quote, would be the most dramatic improvement in bus parking capacity. In conclusion, the Planning Division of the Army Corps sees the underground as a potential solution to DC's flood problem, as well as a possible model for other multi-purpose flood projects around the country. We urge the DC Council to support the Corps' study of the underground, which will be done at no cost to the district. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feldman. Mr. Lehman?
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for the opportunity to speak today. I'll obviously have to revise my remarks a little bit in a further submission because I overstated a point. Clearly, some of the points I made when this proposal was first introduced a few years ago have been integrated. That is specifically about visitor services. I think this is a great project, but it's in the context of flood water remediation. It's a big concept and innovation, but as far as helping DC to re-articulate its visitor services, it doesn't go very far. We're really the only major city in the nation that gets significant amount of tourism that has such a weak system of visitor services. We don't really have a comprehensive welcome center comparable to any major city in the United States. And unfortunately for us, federal welcome centers refuse to distribute local information. So you can go to the White House Visitor Center or the Smithsonian Visitor Center. You can't get any information about DC. That's a problem. So I think not only is this proposal a great opportunity to think about flood remediation and transportation demand management in the Corps, on those characteristics it's excellent, but it really should be seen by the City Council as an opportunity to push forward the creation of a comprehensive tourism management plan for the city, which would include subsector plans for areas like the National Mall, Georgetown, et cetera. And I'll list just a bunch of elements that I've developed basically in response to the National Mall Coalition plan, but also the fact that NCPC and the federal elements have a visitation element in the comp plan, but the district elements of the comp plan do not have a comparable element. Anyway, parking structure, great. Tour bus is great, probably needs even more capacity for that. Using this as an opportunity to create a set of primary and secondary visitor centers, including the one they propose at the National Mall. Developing service corridors underneath the National Mall to provide operational support to waste management and other services needed for the National Mall. In association with planning for the replacement of the Long Bridge, putting a yellow line metro station to serve the Jefferson Memorial, creating secondary visitor centers in association with this, another primary center at Union Station. I presume the one they propose would be the primary one. Reconfiguring National Mall circulator service in support of this and other anchors for a broader visitation service system. Considering replacing the National Mall circulator service with double-deck buses. Long-term, consider creating a National Mall transit service with streetcars comparable to the F-Line Market Street Railway in San Francisco, what Helsinki does, et cetera. Just to wrap up, I'd recommend that the council support this study. It's going to be excellent, but they need to look at it as a component of a broader and detailed tourism development management and marketing plan. Commit to fund separately the creation of that plan and ensure that that plan includes process for the creation of basically subsector plans. My testimony talks about how Destination DC does not fund sub-city visitor services. There's a typo in my written testimony. I'll submit new testimony. So Georgetown doesn't have adequate visitor service centers or information systems. Neither does Capitol Hill, nor does DuPont Circle, nor, I mean, the downtown bid does it, and the core, obviously. You know, next year's the All-Star Game. I wonder if people are even thinking about that in relation to Southwest and Southeast waterfront. So, as they said, planning for larger needs of the district in America, this provides a great opportunity for DC to leverage this initiative and this energy to look at tourism planning more broadly, and this is a component of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. So what I take from your testimony, Mr. Lehman, is that you support the proposal, but this is an opportunity to be discussing what more we could be doing with the mall and with tourism.
Absolutely. I mean, for them to be here today, almost 4 years later, shows it takes a long time to move innovative ideas through the system. And, you know, I have to thank them for encouraging me, in effect, to rethink some of these elements of the way we support or do not support adequately tourism planning in the city. And obviously dealing with stormwater retention and overflow is a huge issue, as you know, from the many hats you wear. The city's doing so many things. This is but one element, especially. It's actually really to be commended, because long-term, that issue is only going to get worse in terms of the impact of climate change on waterfront adjacent areas, which includes areas impacted by the Potomac River and Anacostia River in DC. So yes, excellent plan or excellent proposal, but from an integrated thinking standpoint, not enough. And I hope this is an opportunity for the City Council to take action on that. Mr. Evans isn't here, but I've always been surprised that the Committee on Finance and Revenue doesn't look in comparison to other cities at how the tourism tax revenue stream is used in those cities to support a broader economic development agenda than is supported here for leveraging tourism. If we make, the great thing about tourism and economic development is if we make places great for us as residents, Capitol Hill or Tacoma or Georgetown, they're also attractive to other people who then spend their extra money, including those restaurant taxes that help fund all the things that we want and advocate for in the city as residents and citizens.
Now let me ask Ms. Feldman or Mr. Moore, I want to ask about a little bit more about opposition to this proposal and also what the next steps would be. Let's talk about next steps. So let's say the council approves this resolution. Is it sufficient if I then send a letter to, as chairman of the council, send a letter to the Army Corps of Engineers?
Well, we were directed by Army Corps. We were directed by Army Corps yesterday to the service we would be using called Floodplain Management Services. And the study process says the process for assistance begins after state, regional, local government requests Corps of Engineer assistance under the program. At their option, the requesting organization may provide voluntary contributions toward the requested service to expand the scope or accelerate the provision of those services. What we found in association with that is a fundamentally very simple letter citing Section 206 of the 1960 Flood Control Act and asking the Army Corps to work with DC Council on a review of this project.
I have a draft letter. Is that something that came from the Army Corps?
Yes, it is. It came from the Army Corps. It's a very simple letter,
Yeah,
as
it
you can
is.
see. We would have to amend it with a number of charts and diagrams and stuff like that, but it is a very simple letter. And it's a requirement of the Corps that the jurisdiction at least makes the application. And so, but that's all.
But it doesn't require a contract from the district government.
It doesn't-
Apparently, it asks for a letter, and then it says, "The Corps will work with the requesting organization to develop a scope of work and assemble the appropriate study team for the effort being
Okay.
requested." So it sounds much simpler than the program we had been looking at before, which was the Planning Assistance to States program. This seems to be more straightforward and simpler.
And meanwhile, the National Mall Coalition has developed a relationship with the Army Corps, and they know who you are, so you can work with them on this.
Absolutely. We've been working with the planning entity in Baltimore since 2014. So they know us. We talk regularly. We've had numerous meetings with them, and they're the ones that have proposed that we use this Section
Yes.
206 as opposed to the other, which was complicated.
So you're there, as far as you can tell, they're comfortable with you, meaning the coalition, and they're comfortable with this process that includes the council adopting a sense of the council and then requesting the service of the Army Corps.
Through a letter. That's our understanding as of an email yesterday afternoon from the planning office in Baltimore, yes.
And the cost of this will be picked up by the coalition.
Yes.
Yes.
And this provision, Section 206, actually allows for a private entity, a nonprofit entity, such as the coalition, to fund the project.
Yeah. I mean, what's appealing to me about this is, besides the fact that it's innovative or creative, whichever is the better word, is that, I mean, we're making this request, but the government, I don't have to go find money to pay for this, and it's a feasibility study. It's not making a decision we're going to have this garage, which some people may think is not a good idea. It's to get a feasibility study to tell us whether it's feasible and what the pros and cons are.
Yeah, as we see it, it's really only the first step. As the Army Corps said, what they want to do is they want to take all the studies that we have compiled, and we provided you a list with those, everything from engineering to parking to cost benefit. They want to review all the studies we've done, the flood study done by the government agencies, DC Water, but also, as they point out, they've done their own flood studies, especially in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. So they have compiled, just in the past 5 years, a whole host of additional studies that they want to bring to bear as they evaluate whether or not, one, it's constructible, and two, whether it would actually solve the problem that we say, based on the 2011 study, it would. Because after the 2011 study was done, we were in close conversations with NCPC, and they said they simply didn't have the manpower or the money to do what was required, which was the next level study of those recommendations. And that's what we've done. We've taken one of the recommendations, and I think the Army Corps sees our study as an opportunity also to look at those other options that were proposed in 2011 in addition to ours, and see if they satisfy the needs for flood control as they understand it now.
The Corps particularly likes the fact that this is a flood control project that have multiple use. Most flood control projects have a single use. And so the multiple use, of course, winds up paying for the project.
Still, my understanding is that the Office of Planning is not supportive. That might be putting it nicely. Although I think a few years ago they were supportive. And the Park Service, my understanding, is not supportive, and that's putting it nicely.
I think that's too strongly put. The Office of Planning actually, in 2015, said they were going to partner with the Army Corps, and then a change happened in priorities, and they said that the Federal Triangle flood issue was not a priority any longer. As for the Park Service, because there's been enough confusion about whether the Park Service opposed even a study, we asked the regional director, Bob Vogel, to put in writing what he had been telling us, and he did put in writing that the Park Service does not object to the feasibility study being done by the Army Corps, though historically the Park Service has been against parking for cars. Now, I will point out that in their 2015 tour bus parking study, which was very recent, they didn't look at bus parking under the mall, and they did not look at our National Mall Underground. So our understanding is they have not evaluated our project for bus parking, even though they've done numerous parking studies for buses over the past few years and have not been able to find a solution. So we're hopeful that when the Park Service sees that the tour bus component parking is there, that they will see this as a great advantage. In addition, there was one other thing that we've put into the potential for the project in the future. That is, while the car parking is going to help pay for the facility in its first 5 to 10 years, it could be, if transportation improves, that this becomes a fully tour bus facility, because Arthur has designed a 2-story variety that could be fully tour bus, in which case it could be converted once it's paid for into taking care of even more buses.
It's always tricky to ask somebody to speak for somebody else, but why would the Park Service be opposed? Now, I heard you reminded me that there was that letter because you showed it to me.
It's in the attachments with the...
But maybe it's that there are different views among different people at the Park Service. Not to get into naming any names, but I don't understand why they would be opposed. You're not, I shouldn't say you, but this proposal would not affect the surface of the mall. It would still be open, it would still be green with live turf and trees. From the standpoint of the public, it would be what we have today.
Well, we've been confused as well, which is why we had numerous meetings with the regional director and staff over the years. But what has come back from them repeatedly is that the comprehensive plan wants people not to drive cars, that city and federal policy, NCPC policy, wants to discourage cars, but they never bring up the tour bus parking issue, which I think is an important component left out of the opposition, because we do know the Park Service, as the DC, is desperately looking for ways to get the tour buses off the
Sure,
street.
but how well have we done with getting the cars out of the mall area? I mean, it seems to me,
It's difficult.
I should be asking questions rather than conversation, but it seems to me that if we want to reduce the number of automobiles downtown, we promote alternatives, rather than just simply saying we don't want them and making it inconvenient.
Well, that's what we thought, and we also have looked at Rome, at Paris, at San Francisco, at all the major cities that are major tourist destinations that want their tourists but don't want their cars. Essentially, they build underground parking so that the tourists can come, put the car underground for 2-3 days at a time, and spend their money and their time visiting I mean, we believe, as I think you're suggesting, that we have to look at alternatives, and this is simply a feasibility study that would be the first step, and maybe, as proposed by the other speaker here, who's unfortunately, I don't know your name, it could be the opportunity to also raise a more comprehensive study about what we do with cars and buses as well.
And also in Philadelphia, under Independence Hall, there is parking. That was the same sort of situation. At first, it was the Park Service was concerned, and now I think they think it's a fine facility. So that's a very sort of sanctified space. The the lawn in front of Independence Hall, and it is now have an extensive car parking. But we've designed this in a way that the car parking would only serve people who would be going to the taxpayer-supported museums and memorials that are on the mall.
And if I
Mr.
may,
Lehman?
I'm sorry, this is an illustration of all the different entities and the city not having a comprehensive tourism management plan to kind of set the stage. Now we've sort of ceded for decades that role to the federal government. But NPS, you mentioned parking in the mall area. They say they don't want a parking structure. They don't charge for parking on the streets that they control. So on those, some of the streets that DC still controls, the cross streets, the numbered streets, there will be metered parking sometimes. But for example, on Jefferson Drive and the other one, you can park for free. And if that doesn't encourage people to drive to the core and drive around to try and find a free parking space, I don't know what does. And the other problem with MPS, observationally, is unfortunately they plan by mode. They don't think integratively, even though they did a visitor transportation study about 13 years ago. You can't find it on their website anymore. But MPS did do a visitor transportation study around 2003. But they treat bikes differently. You know, they treat cars one way. They'll fall on this comp plan stuff, and it does discourage driving. But really what the comp plan is supposed to do and does, and is a bicyclist primarily, is someone who runs red lights when there's no traffic. You can do that in the core a lot of the time, even during rush hour, and not be a threat to public safety, because generally transit has done such a great job, and now we have the addition of car sharing, bike sharing, obviously bike and walking. The multiplicative effect of the sustainable modes has tremendous impact on congestion in the core in a positive way. We can see in the National Mall it doesn't work nearly as well. That is an indicator of a need for a study. And anybody in planning, be it MPS, Smithsonian, ideally the Office of Planning, DOEE, DC Water, DDOT, all these entities that should be concerned about this, ought to at least want a plan, because if anything I've learned as a citizen being involved in these issues since approximately 2000, not having plans in place when the velocity of change in the city changed markedly starting in 2000, that puts us at a severe disadvantage. It takes decades. A fast transportation project takes 10 years. So if a fast project takes 10 years, not having plans puts us so far behind. And for other entities of the district government or the federal government to say, not looking at this, we prefer to not look at this important issue, it's mind-boggling.
One other question. I don't know if anybody there at the table can speak to this, but I've also heard that this would be, how do I want to put this, heard through the back channels of the government. There's a concern that there are only so many studies per year the city could conduct with the Army Corps of Engineers, and that this would use up one of those opportunities. Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, I remember that came up, I think when the Office of Planning decided that they were not going to partner. But in all our conversations with the Baltimore Planning Office, they have said that there can be limits on the amount of money the Army can use of its own money in dealing with any one state or entity or district. But when private money is available, or when there's a special need, that they can not only take private money following the proper statute, but that they can also, if necessary, hire outside engineering firms to take on extra work when it's necessary. So I think that was, I did hear that come up in 2015 from the city. They said that, and it was an email from the Office of Planning saying, rather than take on a project done by an external entity, that is our project, they would rather generate projects from within district government and use their relationship with the Army Corps for their own personal, agency needs. So I've heard that. But also, we've talked with the Army about that, and it doesn't seem to be an issue, or should not be an issue, because we are not taking district money for this.
Well, are we aware of them doing, the city doing that many studies with the Army Corps every year?
Well, they're not. This is, since 2014, we tried to get the city actively engaged, and at first, the Office of Planning under Mayor Gray was very, very actively involved, but then with the new administration, we had to wait until people were appointed and so on, and there was a shift in priority. So as far as I know, from talking to Army Corps, they are not partnering with the city right now, except maybe on Oxen Run, one project.
Okay. Mr. Lehman, you wanted to?
It should be obvious to anybody that the Central Business District is the primary economic engine of the city, and that tourism is a significant component of the local economy. And I can believe that the executive branch would argue that that's not a priority. Because they didn't argue for it. But the point is in terms of, again, just the Central Business District alone generates about 20% of the city's property tax revenue and consumes less than 20% of that money in services. It makes no sense to, the impact on those buildings that had flooding, that, for example, the National Archives, and how that impacted not only our consumption of that resource as residents, but also serving other elements of our economy, are pretty significant. And we know, especially starting January 20th, 2017, it's important to broaden the economic resilience of our economy. And I would think that this would have to be one of the biggest priorities in terms of planning with the Army Corps of Engineers and Central Business District resilience and climate change resilience planning.
Could I say one more thing?
Yes.
The big issue for the city has been flooding. People think that the 17th Street levee at Constitution Avenue was created to deal with the 2006 flooding that took down Constitution Avenue buildings and flooded and so on. The 17th Street levee, though, is only for Potomac River overflow down 17th Street. It would not provide any help, because this is interior flooding of higher levels of the city down to Constitution Avenue, which is where Tiber Creek used to be. So we're dealing with a totally different flood issue. And when the FEMA put out their new maps just a couple of years ago, with the 17th Street levee up, the whole area of Constitution Avenue is still in the floodplain. I know DDOE is working right now on insurance rates for flood control areas. This is a huge issue, and we've been surprised that the city didn't act and the federal government didn't act, but we were happy to take it on and try to encourage. But as far as we know, no one has come up with a stormwater flooding solution for the Federal Triangle area besides this one.
Okay. I have no other questions for you guys. Thank you very much. Mr. Lehman, you're going to submit a revised statement? Yes. If there's anything else you want to submit, you're welcome to. The record's open for 2 weeks. That is, the record will close at noon on Monday, April 21st. We'll probably take this up at our council meeting the first Tuesday in May. So that's not definite, but probable. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you very
Judy,
much.
for your
Thank you
testimony.
very much.
That's going to conclude this hearing, which has been on PR 22-190, the sense of the council supporting the National Mall underground parking feasibility study resolution of 2017. The time is now 2:17. I adjourn this hearing, and then the next hearing will begin in a couple of minutes. This hearing's adjourned. Consideration, the final item for consideration for markup by the Committee of the Whole is PR 22-190, which is entitled "The Sense of the Council Supporting the National Mall Underground Parking Feasibility Study Resolution of 2017." This legislation was introduced on March 21st, 2017 by myself and council members Jack Evans and Charles Allen. The purpose of PR 21-190 is to declare the sense of the council to support a National Mall underground parking feasibility study. In order to evaluate the concept of a parking structure built under the National Mall that would also serve as a retention structure to reduce or prevent flooding in the district's Federal Triangle area. The district experienced a severe storm in June 2006 that caused extensive flooding within the Federal Triangle area. Several federal and district agencies formed a Federal Triangle Stormwater Drainage Study Working Group to identify measures to reduce the risk and impact of flooding in the future. One of the potential solutions was the construction of underground cisterns beneath the National Mall to capture and store rainfall to prevent future flooding. The National Mall Coalition is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization which took a further look at the working group's underground storage option beneath the National Mall and offered a proposal to construct a multi-purpose car and tour bus garage and mall visitor center under the mall. This facility would reduce congestion and pollution and improve visitor access to the mall, and importantly, during heavy storm events, could function as a stormwater retention reservoir to prevent flooding and store water for mall irrigation. In order to evaluate underground parking beneath the National Mall as a viable option to prevent future flooding in the Federal Triangle area, the National Mall Coalition must first conduct a feasibility study. This feasibility study will be completed by the Planning Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Baltimore District, under the authority of, there's a citation to federal law here. The cost of the district will be $0 as the National Mall Coalition is committed to covering the $100,000 cost of the study to be paid directly from the National Mall Coalition to the Army Corps, Baltimore District. The National Mall Underground Parking Feasibility Study is a worthy initiative that will allow various stakeholders to realistically evaluate the concept of a parking structure built under the National Mall that would also serve as a retention structure to reduce or prevent flooding in the Federal Triangle area, which is an integral part of the district's identity and livelihood. Consistent with the sense of the council expressed in this resolution, the council will submit a letter to the Army Corps, Baltimore District, requesting that the Corps undertake the National Mall Parking Feasibility Study proposed by the National Mall Coalition. This legislation, as I mentioned earlier, was introduced on March 21st, 2017 by myself and council members Jack Evans and Charles Allen. The Committee of the Whole held a public roundtable on the measure on April 7th, 2017, and the committee has received no testimony or comments in opposition to this resolution. Without objection, I move both the print and the report with leave for staff to make technical, conforming, and editorial changes. Is there discussion on the motion? Again, this is on both the print and the report with leave for staff. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Madam General Counsel, is the measure legally and technically sufficient for our consideration?
It is.
Madam Secretary, is the record complete?
Once a report in the hearing record are filed.
Madam Budget Director, does the measure's fiscal impact statement comply with council requirements?
Yes, it does.
Without objection, this measure will be placed on the consent agenda for today's legislative meeting. We will turn now to consideration.